So Petro, he's a professor at George Brown College, and he's more focused into the education and the research, and he's into construction industry since past 25 years. So I would like to welcome Petro Karanxha from Canada, George Brown College.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Okay, so I know you've been through a lot of training and sessions. So, but at the same time, it's rewarding because knowledge is rewarding. So, as Adnan mentioned, I'm from Toronto, Canada, and I am a professor at George Brown College. And today I want to talk about the BIM education, like what is the status of BIM education in the world and in Canada. And later on we're going to discuss about BIM project planning. Because it's very important to connect those two, since it's very important to connect those two since sorry, I was just doing something, because it's BIM, successful BIM has to have a good foundation when it comes to education, BIM project planning. So I want to start with architecture, engineering, construction, and also facilities management education requirements. So what are education requirements? So education requirements are basically the skills you need so that you succeed at your work. And there has been a change in terms of our industry, of how we used to work 100 years ago. And you can see from the pictures I have posted on the PowerPoint that before you needed to train about line weights with a pencil and making sure your writing was proper, and being able to visualize those two-dimensional plans into the three-dimensional environment. Now this has changed, and we are producing more and more work since the 80s using computers, and not only two-dimensional, but also in the three-dimensional environment. So how does this relate with education, like the way we do work? A lot of academic institutions are still training people into the 2D environment. And but we are producing everything in the 3D environment. So there is a disconnect between the graduates that are coming out of the academia and the work skill force needed in the industry. So clearly one of the biggest questions, and I think this is one of the purposes of this seminar with iWorkstation, to create that awareness of what are the requirements and what type of education we need to succeed in the BIM environment. And also we go and ask another question: what are we teaching about? So before we would teach actually not the process, but the skills of doing something. So how to tighten the bolt, how much we need to tighten the bolt. Now, all of these things are much more easier. Like we don't need to train for those anymore. Now we need to train for more complex situations and buildings, because our buildings are more complex. So that's why we see a lot of applications of the clash detection. So a lot of the firms are implementing clash detection to reduce to reduce the cost of redoing work. And it's very important to understand this because, okay, just give me a second. Okay. It's very important to understand this because you cannot have a successful project without understanding all the technicalities of the projects. So especially here in Canada, I would say most of the general contractors use clash detection as one of the tools to identify any cost savings. And also, we are starting to incorporate in our courses teaching Navisworks and clash detection so that our graduates are prepared about this skill that is required in the industry. So this was just an example, but to further deep into the BIM competencies and what is required for an individual to be BIM competent. So we have software competencies. So software competencies, we understand you want to learn Revit, okay? So to be a Revit competent, you have to see if, because Revit is very wide as a software. I don't think you can be competent in Revit, but you're going to be competent in Revit in terms of what you are supposed to do in Revit. So if you are an architectural firm, you're going to be mostly competent in the software when it comes to the design aspect of Revit. If you are a structural engineer, you would focus more on the structural analysis and the structural aspect. There are also Revit families content creators that are focused only on the family aspect of the BIM. So you have to understand what is the software competencies you have to create and incorporate in your professional skills. Then there are process competencies. So software competencies are very easy to identify and incorporate. But when it comes to process competencies, it becomes a little bit not complicated, but it needs a little bit more experience. So you have to understand what processes are you doing in your work environment, and how are these processes incorporated in BIM. So for example, one example that I use is estimating. If you are an estimator, how do you do your regular process, or a quantity surveyor? You take the drawings, you read the drawings, and then you start identifying what are the different shapes on the drawing, so you can get some volumes, areas, to understand what type of materials you are going to need for the project. Now, how does this process changes when you are on the 3D environment? So a lot of those checking the drawings, actually it's not needed anymore, because the software will produce automatically some of these areas and volumes. So what you need to identify is, are those volumes and areas correct, or you need to add something? So this has to do with the process competencies. The third one will be research competencies. And research competencies have to do with any new software that comes out, or any new process that the BIM process brings in your firm or in your work. How are you able to incorporate those? And are those softwares compatible with what you do? Or this process is compatible with you do? So I'll give you an example. There was a list internet with more than 160 different software claiming to do BIM, but they all are part of the BIM process. So some of them are good for estimating, but there is no other use for them. Or some are good for scheduling, but there is no other use for them. So you as a professional have to do that research and start to identify, will this process or software will be compatible for your firm? Because basically that's what will give the competency and also the business advantage in the industry. Then we talk about IT competencies, and IT competencies have to do with understanding what type of hardware and software you need. So for example, just to mention processors on computers, you need to understand what type of software you are dealing with and what type of processor you need. Because that processor, if you are using, let's say, for gaming and you use it for computers, a graphic card for those type of processors, it will probably cost $500. But if you look for a processor that deals with geometric shape, like in Revit or any point clouds, then we're talking about $2,000 or $3,000 processor. So even understanding what type of costs you will have to run with the BIM in the BIM environment, it's very important. And this number 5 is one of my favorites, which is collaboration and communication competencies, because if you don't have this, you don't have BIM, but actually you have what a lot of people refer to as the lonely BIM. So you have one person, one computer, one model, and nobody communicates. So it's just lonely BIM, you and your model. So the whole power of BIM is in the collaboration and communication of different data between the models, between the stakeholders involved in the process. So what are the main barriers of using BIM? So the second annual BIM report from Toronto BIM community in association with Building Smart that was done in Canada, I have highlighted in red here that most of the issues, if you see on your left-hand side, there is corporate issues, individual issues, and industry issues. So I would say usually more than 30% of the people that were interviewed and took this the survey regarding this. So it's more than, I think the number is around 250 or 300 BIM professionals around the industry. All the issues that I have highlighted in red are educational issues, so resistant to change. You usually resist to change because you don't understand change, or and this is an industry issue. Industry is slow to adopt BIM. Why? Because they don't know if this is going to work or no, and there is no client demand. So mostly what the clients at least in the Canadian environment, there usually is a client demand for any process to be adopted. And there is clearly no client understanding of what BIM is. So there has to be even client education when it comes to BIM. Then we focus on individual issues. So most of the individuals, they say, okay, there is lack of knowledge and skills. So you have to educate for the skill. And there is software learning curves. So a lot of firms do not adopt BIM right away because there is the fear of the learning curve. Like these people, like all the firms, have still to be in business. They cannot just start testing software and hoping that it will work. So that learning curve, it's very, it is actually scary for some, not for some, but for most of the companies, especially if it's a small company. And then there is lack of training. Like, where do you get proper BIM training? There is, I think England has some masters in BIM, but still there is no clear education environment for BIM. Then we have corporate issues. So for example, lack of senior management support. I've been on meetings when some of this upper management will say, what happens if we don't have energy and your laptop doesn't work? How are we going to get the information from BIM? So still there is that understanding and engagement of the senior management that is not really happening in BIM, and lack of in-house expertise. So there is a saying that it's easier to learn a dog new tricks than to make him forget all tricks and then learn new tricks. So there is a process of, okay, how do we change what we know and we do in CAD, and how do we incorporate what we do in 3D and the BIM environment? So skilled BIM candidates needed by industry are not enough. So we can see that here in the Greater Toronto area as well. There is, I see a lot of postings, and in all of these postings, I see we need somebody with 5 years of experience in BIM. But where do you find somebody with 5 years of experience in BIM? Well, most of the people are just starting to go through the BIM education and adoption. So there has to be a connection between industry of what do they need, what type of training they need, and also in the academic world, like how do we train for BIM? Because there has to be that interaction of understanding. And also requirements of how to become a successful BIM coordinator or BIM specialist or BIM manager. There has to be a defined set of skills. We had a seminar with Toronto BIM community probably a couple of months ago, and the whole idea was to identify what are the job titles in the BIM industry and what do they do. So we had BIM directors, invited BIM managers, BIM coordinators, and BIM specialists. And when you see what they do and how they, what type of work they do, it was not clear of the title of what what is it that their responsibilities are. So for example, you have, there was a BIM coordinator that he didn't have a boss, so he was leading the whole BIM process. And then you had a BIM director that was also working on Revit families. So there is no clear understanding as of yet. So I think are very exciting times, because all the people that start to be trained and understand how the process works will be the ones that will lead this. And also important note, BIM is not software. Please don't refer to BIM as Revit, or that's just something I always enforce in all my presentations. Now, what is a successful BIM platform? In the BIM and Construction Management second edition by Brad Harding and Dave McCool, BIM is a cultural shift in mindset in the way AEC management teams collaborate. Now, what does that mean? So, successful BIM platform requires three steps, so the three-legged stool, as they call it. So it requires tools, and tools is all your software or your laser scanners or any VR, AR, all these tools that are being incorporated, like tools, technology. So that is one of the supporting pillars. The other one will be processes. So how do you do estimating, scheduling, procurement, like how do you incorporate BIM in all these processes? And one aspect that not many people talk about is behavior. How do you change the behavior of your staff, of your firm, in terms of how to behave now in BIM, in this new environment? Because all of this change the way you do business and the way you do you actually do your work. So this picture also comes from the book, and it shows a group of engineers and architects and contractors in a boat. That boat represents a project. So anytime your projects start to sink, you think that, oh, glad sure the hull is not at our end, but you will be affected. Like from the perspective of you have to finish that that project, so that boat has to arrive somewhere, and by going down, someone has to take the water out. Being architect or being engineer or being constructor, it's still, you're part of that boat. So during my school year, I want my students to understand two questions. One is, what do I need to do my job as an AEC professional? So if you are in a BIM environment, what do you need to do your job? Like, what are your skill set that you need to acquire? Job. So how do that communication happen? So those are, I think, very important questions if you would want to be successful in and one is geometry and the other one is data. And in here also I see a lot of people focusing on geometry but not enough on the data. And one of the most powerful tools in any software is actually the properties, the data properties on any that is associated with the geometry, because a lot of the information is embedded there. And if you see the different stages that a project goes through, we have pre-construction, pre-design. So we have project brief, pre-design, design, pre-construction, construction. Then we go to facilities management. So we have to identify how much geometry we need through these phases and how much data. Because by identifying this, we have identified how you're going to have a successful BIM project. So all of this is part of the education that has to be taught on how to properly incorporate the geometry and the data in a project. So I'll go back to my other slide and still ask the question, what do I need to do my job as an AC professional, and what do others need from me to do theirs? So how do you go from one stage of the project, so let's say from design to construction? So what type of 3D design to construction? Because one of the issues in general is that we just give the final product. We don't share all the knowledge that is acquired during the process of one of the phases. So during design, at the end you just deliver a model, but it's not identified what the decision process has been through developing that model. So all that knowledge has to be shared. So going back to the three-legged stool, I am just representing it here in a pie chart, and you have people, process, and technology, and for those three to be successful, there has to be collaboration and communication. And how do you communicate, exchange, and update the data needed in the project? So those are very important aspects of the BIM education and BIM requirements. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we at the college have identified, okay, how to incorporate those BIM competencies. So we did our program in 3 semesters, where at the beginning we learned the behaviors on a personal level, processes on a personal level, and also tools based on one project. So the students go on one project and they start learning Tekla, Revit, Navisworks. So all these different, but on a personal level. Then on semester 2, it goes to actual group process, which means students are placed into groups to also now answer those questions. How do I do my job? But also, how do I help others to do their job? And how does that process changes from the lonely BIM, and what types of tool and what type of communication and collaboration we have to do for our projects. So, and then semester 3 is work practicum at a relevant company in terms of BIM, like practicing what they learn. So regarding our first part, that is education, is even though BIM is being mandated in many countries, there is an immense need for BIM education that comes in, I would say, in 3 different forms. There is a need for training provided to firms to implement BIM. There is training provided to graduates entering the workforce. And there is training provided to industry for skill upgrades. So I think there is a big need for all of these three for BIM to be successful, and eventually it will happen. It's all a matter of if you're going to be part of this process or not. So I think that will be the first part of the presentation. So if you have any questions, I could answer regarding this, and then we can go to the BIM execution plan.
Yeah, Ricardo, is there any question from anyone here from the audience? He was explaining about the course, particular course in Canada that is offered by George Brown College. Am I right? Yeah, there's one question. We can check it.
Lakshay has a question.
Yeah, Petro,
Yeah.
hear me, right? Yeah, there's a question from
It's one of the issues in general and very less people talk about. So in your Toronto BIM meetup, what was the solution that you came up to how to properly cultivate behavior of BIM in today's industries? Well, I think this is a very good question, and I think a lot of people have these questions, but in my opinion, I think it has to do with the company having a BIM champion. So someone at the company has to lead this behavior change in not only on the staff but also on the process, because it's very important to understand that by changing what type of software you're going to use, you are going to change the process of how your firm works. So that's why it's very important to understand that there is going to be a behavior change and resistance in that behavior. So think of something that you do every day, and somebody comes and tells you, oh, you have to change the way you do this thing. The first reaction of every human being will be like, no, I don't want to do this. I'm okay doing it the way I'm doing it, even though it might be more efficient the other way. So also that behavior change have to come from like decision makers. Like we had projects with governments, and the moment the person that was leading that change left, everything fell through because there was no more BIM champion to foster that behavior change. So people just fall back into doing their normal day-to-day tasks, and I guess that's the answer to this.
Yeah. We proceed for the part 2.
Okay. I had a video, so maybe I want to show the video now. Oh, sorry, I don't share this. Yes. So
Petro, can you switch off your video? Share your screen only. So there's a slight lag between it.
no. Can you see my video now?
Yeah, we can see your video, but we cannot hear it.
You cannot hear it?
No.
So this is one of the this is one of the first projects we did. It's actually Ashbridges Bay Yacht Club. So this was the Revit model that we built. But this Revit model that we built came actually from the point cloud. And when you're going to see this animation over with the Revit portion, then you're going to see the point cloud. So we use the LiDAR technology to capture the data, and it's I think around the 3 square kilometers of a site. And a lot of the things that we did here, because it was our first project, were try and error. So this was the basis of us starting to produce our BIM project planning from now on into all of our research projects. And how do we properly incorporate those research projects with BIM planning. So trying to understand the data and whatnot. So Ashbridges Yacht Club, they didn't have any data on their clubhouse and the docks, or they also had a seawall all around that they didn't have any data on that as well. So by using the technology, we were able to capture all of this. So I'm going to go back to my presentation. So why do we need a BIM execution plan? We need it because we need to understand how a model is developed, okay, how the data is populated, and how the information produced will be used. So again, we have to understand the 3 questions. To have why can I hear my